File 17 of A Treatise of Human Nature by David Hume, Volume 1. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by George Yeager, Book 1, Part 3, Section 2, of Probability and of the Idea of Cause and Effect. This is all I think necessary to observe concerning those four relations which are the foundation of science. But as to the other three, which depend not upon the idea, and may be absent or present even while that remains the same, it will be proper to explain them more particularly. These three relations are identity, the situations in time and place, and causation. All kinds of reasoning consist in nothing but a comparison and a discovery of those relations, either constant or inconstant, which two or more objects bear to each other. This comparison we may make either when both the objects are present to the senses, or when neither of them is present, or when only one. When both the objects are present to the senses, along with the relation, we call this perception rather than reasoning. Nor is there in this case any exercise of the thought or any action, properly speaking, but a mere passive admission of the impressions through the organs of sensation. According to this way of thinking, we ought not to receive as reasoning any of the observations we may make concerning identity and the relations of time and place, since in none of them the mind can go beyond what is immediately present to the senses, either to discover the real existence or the relations of objects. It is only causation which produces such a connection as to give us assurance from the existence or action of one object that it was followed or preceded by any other existence or action. Nor can the other two relations be ever made use of in reasoning, except so far as they either affect or are affected by it. There is nothing in any objects to persuade us that they are either always remote or always contiguous. And when from experience and observation we discover that their relation in this particular is invariable, we always conclude there is some secret cause which separates or unites them. The same reasoning extends to identity. We readily suppose an object may continue individually the same, though several times absent from and present to the senses, and ascribe to it an identity notwithstanding the interruption of the perception, whenever we conclude that if we had kept our eye or hand constantly upon it, it would have conveyed an invariable and uninterrupted perception. But this conclusion beyond the impressions of our senses can be founded only on the connection of cause and effect. Nor can we otherwise have any security that the object is not changed upon us, however much the new object may resemble that which was formerly present to the senses. Whenever we discover such a perfect resemblance, we consider whether it be common in that species of objects, whether possibly or probably any cause could operate in producing the change and resemblance, and according as we determine concerning these causes and effects, we form our judgment concerning the identity of the object. Here, then, it appears that of those three relations which depend not upon the mere ideas, the only one that can be traced beyond our senses and informs us of existences and objects which we do not see or feel is causation. This relation, therefore, we shall endeavor to explain fully before we leave the subject of the understanding. To begin regularly, we must consider the idea of causation and see from what origin it is derived. It is impossible to reason justly without understanding perfectly the idea concerning which we reason. And it is impossible perfectly to understand any idea without tracing it up to its origin and examining that primary impression from which it arises. The examination of the impression bestows a clearness on the idea, and the examination of the idea bestows a like clearness on all our reasoning. Let us therefore cast our eye on any two objects which we call cause and effect, and turn them on all sides in order to find that impression which produces an idea of such prodigious consequence. At first sight, I perceive that I must not search for it in any of the particular qualities of the objects, since whichever of these qualities I pitch on, I find some object that is not possessed of it, and yet falls under the denomination of cause or effect. And indeed, there is nothing existent, either externally or internally, which is not to be considered either as a cause or an effect, though it is plain there is no one quality which universally belongs to all beings and gives them a title to that denomination. The idea, then, of causation must be derived from some relation among objects, and that relation we must now endeavor to discover. I find, in the first place, that whatever objects are considered as causes or effects are contiguous, and that nothing can operate in a time or place which is ever so little removed from those of its existence. Though distant objects may sometimes seem productive of each other, they are commonly found, upon examination, to be linked by a chain of causes which are contiguous among themselves and to the distant objects. And when in any particular instance we cannot discover this connection, we still presume it to exist. We may therefore consider the relation of contiguity as essential to that of causation, at least may suppose it such, according to the general opinion, till we can find a more, see Part 4, Section 5, proper occasion to clear up this matter by examining what objects are or are not susceptible of juxtaposition and conjunction.
Okay, so the approach here, and this is, we're getting into one of the famous chapters, the critique of causation. I'm not particularly scared about this. I might have a few comments, but he tries to take on, okay, let me look at these objects that are behaving, that seems to have some connection between them. Let me look very closely and see what I can find. It's sort of a, grabbing the child by the hand, let's go and take a look sort of approach, right? And I'm sort of fine with that. I'm just sort of slightly baffled about how wordy he is about it, right? He says a lot of stuff without really saying much here in the beginning. In this particular parts of the book I've been dealing with in the last parts of my deconstruction here. He seems it is this sort of a notion I get that when people are writing sort of important texts, they would like them to be long and long-winded or very rich in words and explanations to make it feel like it's sort of a very big and important. You can't write a book on a treatise of philosophy in 30 pages, right? It has to be 400 pages, otherwise nobody will take it seriously. And it does, I think, suffer a bit from this, which is also probably ascribable to youthful nature, youthful pretense, to some extent at least. I mean, he's in his late 20s when he's writing this, mid to late 20s. So he's not a teenager. But if you go and listen to, for instance, Schubert is a good example, the classical composer, who was at least a bit contemporary to Beethoven, my personal favorite, right? If you take, for instance, the Fifth Symphony of Schubert, it's very light, although there were sort of darker elements here and there, but it's very simple, melodic, straight up simplicity and youthful, sort of what would you, not simplicity, but youthful, lack of sort of maturity, you could say. When you go to, for instance, Schubert's Eighth Symphony, the so-called unfinished, it's a different beast, right? Then we're dealing with the very dark and moody sort of build-up of the first movement and so on, right? So there is sort of this transition that I guess all human beings go through, that whatever point they're in, they think they're the best, and then a couple of years later they think, I'm wiser now, right? I wasn't so wise when I did that 3 years ago, and then 3 years after that, they can look back and say, no, I'm still even more, mature now, right? And I'm still learning, right? I'm still personally learning. I've been doing this for more than 10 years, right? Maybe upwards of 12 to 13 years I've been thinking along these lines, right? At least hardcore for 10 years, right? At least for 10 years. And I'm still honing my skill. I'm still clarifying. I'm still simplifying. I'm still getting better, and what is important, what is less important, sort of balancing my philosophy and how to frame it and how to argue and what needs to be argued to get this, there, and the other right. This might suffer a bit from somebody who sort of got a few points. I'm hastening a guess here, right? I can see Hume, and he's been studying since he was 12 years on the university in Edinburgh, right? And maybe he's got a job or whatever, teaching. I don't know what he did in his youth, right? But there's 3 or 4 things where he thinks that this is new philosophy. Nobody has ever thought of it this way. And therefore he thinks, these are so important, I could actually write a book about it. But then he sort of, okay, then I have to encompass all of philosophy into this treatise, where these particular important talking points that he sort of come up with until then has to be sort of implanted, right? And then he might not have thought out all of the other aspects of the complete philosophy for a treatise sufficiently well in order to be able to do a very well-rounded full treatise, which takes a lot of experience of thinking, and maybe not to have the philosophy, but merely to make it so that it's understandable for other people when they read it and can follow along and so on, right? And have a good sense of where the important points are and be very clear and so on, right? So this might suffer a bit from that, but this is sort of just my, first impression here, right? But otherwise, he's sort of, I like when he starts to say, okay, now we are going to take a look at this, right? Then I'm sort of sharpen my attention. Other times it seems more polemic, right? So, but let's see what he does now.
The second relation I shall observe as essential to causes and effects is not so universally acknowledged, but is liable to some controversy. It is that of priority of time in the cause before the effect. Some pretend that it is not absolutely necessary a cause should precede its effect, but that any object or action in the very first moment of its existence may exert its productive quality and give rise to another object or action perfectly cotemporary with itself. But beside that experience in most instances seems to contradict this opinion, we may establish the relation of priority by a kind of inference or reasoning. It is an established maxim, both in natural and moral philosophy, that an object which exists for any time in its full perfection without producing another is not its sole cause, but is assisted by some other principle which pushes it from its state of inactivity and makes it exert that energy of which it was secretly possessed. Now, if any cause may be perfectly cotemporary with its effect, it is certain, according to this maxim, that they must all of them be so, since any one of them which retards its operation for a single moment exerts not itself at that very individual time in which it might have operated, and therefore is no proper cause. The consequence of this would be no less than the destruction of that succession of causes which we observe in the world, and indeed the utter annihilation of time. For if one cause were cotemporary with its effect, and this effect with its effect, and so on, it is plain there would be no such thing as succession, and all objects must be coexistent. If this argument appears satisfactory, it is well. If not, I beg the reader to allow me the same liberty which I have used in the preceding case of supposing it such, for he shall find that the affair is of no great importance. Having thus discovered or supposed the two
I think I'll back up a bit here and go back and check out this one. The consequence of this would be no less than the destruction. Maybe there's there would no less than the destruction of the succession of causes which we observe in the world, and indeed the utter annihilation of time. For if one cause were cotemporary with its effect, and this effect with its effect, and so on, it's plain there would be no such thing as succession. No, sort of all will be lumped in a big pile, so to say. Yeah, I guess that's... And all objects must be coexistent. This very abstract thinking he's doing here. He's trying to do a reductio ad absurdum, I think. It sounds like it to me. I'm not sure exactly what he's trying here. He's sort of pretends that if something weren't the case, everything was sort of slammed together in no time and no object and sort of coexistent. It has to be some stretched out. But again, this time he has been dealing with, it's not very clear if he considered that. Well, it's actually clear. It's clear that he considers it both an impression and an idea. And I don't believe that, as I've stated in that particular chapter. But how does that affect, if you can experience time as an impression, why wouldn't you be able to experience causation then? I mean, when you're talking about causation, you are referencing some particular objects that are composed of particular sensations, merely the sensory, color, sound, taste, and so on. Shape, maybe, right? And then these objects are predicted to move in this particular fashion. When this is the case, then the next thing is that this will be the case. And we are saying that this causes this. I don't think it's sort of there's some linearity to it, in sort of maybe in an abstract fashion. If you try to draw it out, this will be this, and then happen this, and then happen this, or in causational chain, as he also refers to. So if you can have an idea, an impression of time, why wouldn't you have, or maybe I understood this thing as about time, but I think that's, or I would say that that's my understanding of what is writing. So why wouldn't you have a sense of causation? Well, then I would say, well, if you can't have an idea of causation other than some kind of abstract form, then why would you have a sense of time then? Why would you have an idea of time? It's as faint and immaterial to me as causation is. So it's he uses time in this kind of, he said, utter annihilation of time, but time is sort of as faint or as similar kind of faintness as causation. Now, it might be the case that you could better explain what time is in the way that I say it's a mental distance between events or memories, let's say, right? Or a memory and now, you could say. The front end of the memories is the actual now that is going to be a memory in just a short while, right? But then causation is that if I have this experience now based on my prior memories, then I'm going to predict that this is going to be the case in X amount of time. And the same kind of time distance measurement quantification as I am using in the memory of my mind, right? So it's extending it's a prediction of what the next memory is going to be based on a particular experience in the now, when that future becomes the now, right? That was kind of convoluted. Sorry about that. So these are aspects that are very prone to get screwed around and sort of you lose touch with what you're doing, right? And he just has to be careful, right? So I think we'll go to the next page.
Relations of contiguity and succession to be essential to causes and effects, I find I am stopped short and can proceed no farther in considering any single instance of cause and effect. Motion in one body is regarded upon impulse as the cause of motion in another. When we consider these objects with utmost attention, we find only that the one body approaches the other, and that the motion of it precedes that of the other, but without any sensible interval. It is in vain to rack ourselves with farther thought and reflection upon this subject. We can go no farther in considering this particular instance. Should any one leave this instance and pretend to define a cause by saying it is something productive of another, it is evident he would say nothing. For what does he mean by production?
Well, one way to think of this is, no, there is no color, sound, taste, or anything that you could point to as causation. It is an observation of comparing memories with the present and trying to predict something, right? It is a foundation of doing science. Causation is a necessary axiom to work from, you could say, maybe, in order to do science. Otherwise, why would you do it if you don't believe, or you don't have to believe. I don't want to bring in belief. That's stupid of me, right? If you don't go with it, and I would say it's ridiculous to claim that you're not going with causation, because, I mean, you put in the car, you twist the key, right, and you expect particular things to happen, right? And there's nothing wrong with that. I would say what Hume points to is you can't experience. You can't have an impression of causation. You can't find it anywhere, right? It's only a matter of analyzing your memories and saying, whenever I did that, this seems to be the case afterwards at this so and so many ticks of the clock, right? And I'm going to call that causation. It's not like when when I jump, I go sideways sometimes, then I go that way, and then I go down to the center of the earth. Sometimes I get to the moon, sometimes I spin around when I jump. When I jump, I go up in a certain distance and down, back down again in the same fashion as I usually do, right? So there's sort of causation. There's something when I do this tends to happen, right? And usually it happens all the time, right? Unless something else comes in and mixes up with it, then there's a new situation, right? But there's no problem in doing that, right? Just because I can't see radio waves, for instance, that doesn't mean that I can work with a radio and take the chance that they're going to be something that is called radio waves that potentially goes from this sender to this receiver and so on, right? So it's like he's very strict on impression here, right? But I don't understand why he needs to have when he needs to have impression here. Why didn't he need to have impression of space? Because he says that it's an impression of space, as far as I understood, but I don't see an impression of space, right? I see a spatiality to my experience, but that doesn't mean that I have that must mean that the space is arriving, right? So it's like when I turn on the light, I can see my living room. So therefore, the living room arrives with the light. It's not necessarily a good argumentation, right? So maybe I'm getting a little caught up in myself here, but maybe we should get to the next step.
To give any definition of it that will not be the same with that of causation. If he can, I desire it may be produced. If he cannot, he here runs in a circle and gives a synonymous term instead of a definition. Shall we then rest contented with these two relations of contiguity and succession as affording a complete idea of causation? By no means. An object may be contiguous and prior to another without being considered as its cause. There is a necessary connection to be taken into consideration, and that relation is of much greater importance than any of the other two above mentioned. Here again, I turn the object on all sides in order to discover the nature of this necessary connection and find the impression or impressions from which its idea may be derived. When I cast my eye on the known qualities of objects, I immediately discover that the relation of cause and effect depends not in the least on them. When I consider their relations, I can find none but those of contiguity and succession, which I have already regarded as imperfect and unsatisfactory. Shall the despair of success make me assert that I am here possessed of an idea which is not preceded by any similar impression? This would be too strong a proof of levity and inconstancy, since the contrary principle has been already so firmly established as to admit of no farther doubt, at least till we have more fully examined the present difficulty. We must therefore proceed like those who, being in search of anything that lies concealed from them, and not finding it in the place they expected, beat about all the neighboring fields without any certain view or design, in hopes their good fortune will at last guide them to what they search for.
There's a weakness in his ontology, and that is the dichotomy of the impressions and the ideas. I'm not saying you can't do that, but he might be looking for answers in the wrong places. What I would say is the starting point of your philosophy is your qualia. That is the colors, sounds, tastes, touch, and smell, right? These 5 are the starting point. Everything else falls from that. Now, if I will have to, whatever I refer to in my philosophy, I will have to be able to track back to that experience, right? These qualia. Somehow or another, I have to, and I don't have to come up with shit and then try to connect it back. I will have to start with the colors and then work my way upwards, you could say, to whatever, elephants and government and cars and whatever, right? Science, whatever you want, right? And then it has to be built from the ground up, right? And therefore it should be traceable back to that reduction base, which is the colors and sounds and taste and so on. Now, that is the starting point, and that is also, for me then, the checking point of whether we are dealing with something that can exist or be, yes, let us put it this way, maybe not exist, but am I referring to something that is actually a part of my philosophy? A part of philosophy? Because if I were to go and say, I'm not talking about my experience, I'm talking about something outside my experiences. Well, at what point did you get to jump out of your experiences, right? At least you would have to explain that. And if you're starting with your experiences, at what point do you all of a sudden, now I have to go outside my experiences, right? And this keeps you in your place. And you will also have a checking point, as I referred to, where you have to say, well, does it have a color? Does it have a sound? Can I build from something? Can I build from these colors and the next step from that, or derivative, as I usually call it, and then the derivative from that, or derivative from that? Will I end up somewhere where I have to say, now I have causation, right? And if I have causation, I might want to check, have I argued rigidly for this? Or I am just putting shit together that doesn't really, it's not rigid. Then I maybe have to get rid of it, right? I would say that you wouldn't be able to fit causation into this. It's an axiom that there is some connection, necessary connection, as he calls it, right? There's a necessary connection that we can't get to, right? And it's a way of saying that it's a useful tool to work from this necessary connection. Then when I see this yellow curvy thing, it's a banana and I can eat it, or, causation, right? This will happen. I will taste some sweetness and some whatever, banana tastiness and, benefit from the nutrition, whatever, right? This is a cause and effect. That's how we work. Just because we can't experience it doesn't mean that we can't work from it, right? And just because we can't experience it doesn't mean that it's necessarily not there. But just because we want it to be there doesn't mean that it's there, right? It's this thing about, I can't say it is there, but I can't say that it isn't there either. Right? So in that case, there's only one solution, in my opinion, and that is an axiom. That's saying if you need to go down that road, right? I would say that all human beings need to do that because they seem to all be working from an idea, in my opinion, from cause and effect, right? And I would say they wouldn't survive if it didn't. So, right? So it's an axiom. It's not an impression, right? it's not a part of your philosophy as such in the ground floor understanding of it, right? And I don't think you can argue your way to it. You can just say, at this point, I need to make an axiom, and I will call that causation or necessary connection or whatever, right? Okay.
It is necessary for us to leave the direct survey of this question concerning the nature of that necessary connection which enters into our idea of cause and effect, and endeavor to find some other questions, the examination of which will perhaps afford a hint that may serve to clear up the present difficulty. Of these questions there occur two which I shall proceed to examine. That is, first, for what reason we pronounce it necessary that everything whose existence has a beginning should also have a cause. Secondly, why we conclude that such particular causes must necessarily have such particular effects, and what is the nature of that inference we draw from the one to the other, and of the belief we repose in it. I shall only observe, before I proceed any farther, that though the ideas of cause and effect be derived from the impressions of reflection as well as from those of sensation, yet for brevity's sake, I commonly mention only the latter as the origin of these ideas, though I desire that whatever I say of them may also extend to the former. Passions are connected with their objects and with one another no less than external bodies are connected together. The same relation, then, of cause and effect, which belongs to one, must be common to all of them. End of file 17.
Okay, so a convoluted introduction to cause and effect, and it will be a part of the section 3 also, why a cause is always necessary. So I don't I don't quite understand why he makes it so convoluted. It's quite simple to me, right? And I think maybe it points to a problem I seem to have uncovered about philosophies. It's not good enough for a philosopher to say, I am deciding to go with this because I need it for the next part of my philosophy. It's like you feel like I think they feel like they're cheating or something. They're just coming up with shit. Yeah, but they're saying this is my axiom, right? Rather than philosophy be something that's sitting on their perched on their chairs, telling the world this is how it is, follow it, right? That would be saying instead, well, I need this in my philosophy. This is my philosophy. I need this axiom. I can't see any way in order to be rigid about it. I won't claim that I can argue for it. I won't claim that I can deduce it. I won't claim anything. I will just say I'm going with it. And if you don't like it, you don't have to follow it, right? It's sort of a simple and down-to-earth approach, right? And because people, and generally people call themselves philosophers, tend to have a very, very hard time and not even consider this a possibility of how to do philosophy, they go into tirades of shit in order to get somewhere, right? And then they create something like meta-ethics, right? That is so fucking ridiculously convoluted and complicated that nobody in the right mind would use that in any kind of philosophy, in my opinion, right? Otherwise, unless they really want to convolute and complexify things, right? So if you can't argue, you use an axiom, right? You're just saying, I am going with the idea of causation, that when things are put together this way, I expect it to behave, or this to be the case because of what I call causation, which is an axiom. That there is some hidden connection I can't get to, but it seems to whenever I eat a banana, it comes out the other end as a different color, right? Um, and it doesn't have to be more complicated than that. I mean, you can't just axiomize your way through all of your philosophy, but I think a lot of philosophy has to be axiomized in order to get somewhere. Otherwise, you will go into all sorts of harebrained sophistry and cherry pick your reasoning and try to whatever, right? I don't buy that, right? Just be honest and say, well, I guess I can't argue for this. I guess I have to make an axiom, right? It might turn out in the end that somebody has actually made that jump, and you can say, wow, that's great philosophy. I'm going to take that on board. I can ditch my axiom and say I have actually argumentation here instead of the axiom. So I don't need the axiom, right? And it's there is a lot of, I think, appeal to authoritarianism in humans, right? It has to be one way. It's this thinking. No, there has to be agreement, right? Okay. Only 55% of people agree on this. Then they have to force the other 45% to do it as they think it, because we all have to do the same things. There has to be rules. No, there's not this idea of every single person can have their own way, right? Why is that not possible? They may be limited on what they can agree with other people on, and then they can get what they want. But that doesn't mean that they can't have the philosophy, right? So, again, this is sort of I'm a very sort of free-thinking kind of person. I like to be able to say no thank you, right? I like to exercise my ability to say no thank you. And it seems the further we get ahead in the 21st century, the less I get to say no thank you. I can say it, but I can't act upon it. I can't get my will that way. In situation where I find it's completely possible, but somebody else is appealing to some kind of rule or law that somebody has said, that said everybody has to do it this way or you can be shot, right? It's not going to end well. Let me just put it that way, right? It might not be in 10 years or 20 years, but sometime in the future, some shit is going to go down because of this appeal to authority, right? There has to be always the ability to say no thank you to association, right? That is sort of a core idea. And it's not very difficult to understand. I mean, if you can't understand that, then you cannot possibly understand anything, right? And this is also an idea of cause and effect. I don't want this cause because then I'm going to get an effect I don't want. So I want to say no thank you to this cause, right? So, okay. This is the end of this part, and please share, like, and subscribe. Consider a donation, please. Links below and on the board. Also links below. Give me a comment. What do you think so far? And otherwise, have a nice day. See you in the next one.